Good evening. So, it's been a bit of a week, and as some of you may have noticed, there's been a bit of a slight delay in the last approach to the Lost World. Hello, cat. Let's try it over here. There is unfortunately only so much that I can do in the week, but we've now moved on to the next serialisation of the Lost World. So we've completed the Strand Volume 1, and now we're on to Volume 2. Remembering that the Lost World was originally not a book, but was a series of shorts placed in the Strand magazine in 1912. So far, we've met Malone, and he's encountered Professor Challenger and had his altercations with him. But now we're joining them as Malone heads to see the Professor Challenger at the evening meeting with his other peers. Now, you're going to sit down so I can read this? I think it'd be a good idea. Unfortunately, we've a bit of a heat wave here. 38 degrees Celsius the other day, and this one is behaving a little bit strangely at the moment and shedding terribly. Thank you for that, cat. Now, are you going to sit down? No. I want to get on with this. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. Yes, we know the book smells strange, but just sit down, okay? Terribly sorry, but apparently we have to wait. Okay, so if you're going to stand there, I can still read. You ready? On an entirely personal note, I know that these books aren't so much in keeping with the medical aspect of the channel, but to be honest, I actually quite enjoy reading The Lost World, and it gives me a bit of a focus as well. Not only that, but it gives my sister's nephew something to go to sleep to, hopefully. Right. Go on, down, down. There you go. You settle. I think we're good to go. The Lost World, Chapter 5. Questions. What with the physical shocks incidental to my first interview with Professor Challenger, and the mental ones which accompanied the second, I was somewhat demoralised by the time I found myself in Enmore Park once more. In my aching head, the one thought throbbing that there really was a truth in this man's story, that it was of tremendous consequence, and that it would work up into an inconceivable copy for the Gazette when I could obtain permission to use it. A taxicab was waiting at the end of the road, so I sprang into it and drove down to the office. McArdle was at his post as usual. "Well," he cried expectantly, "what may it run to?" "I'm thinking, young man, you've been in the wars. Don't tell me that he assaulted you." We had a little difference at first." What a man he is. What did you do?" "Well, he became more reasonable, and then we had a chat. But I got nothing out of him. Well, nothing for publication." "I'm not so sure about that. You've got a black eye out of him. That's for publication. We can't have this reign of terror, Mr. Malone. We must bring the man to his bearings. I'll have a leaderette on him tomorrow that'll raise a blister. Just give me the material and I'll engage to brand the fellow forever. Professor Munchausen, eh? How's that for an inset headline? Sir John Mandeville, Castiglio, all impostors and bullies in history. I'll show him up for the fraud that he is." "Well, I wouldn't do that, sir." "Aye, why not?" "Because he's not a fraud at all." "What?" roared McArdle. You don't mean to say you really believe that stuff about mammoths and mastodons and great sea serpents? Well, I don't know about that. I don't think he makes any claims of the kind, but I do believe he's got something new. Oh, then, for pity's sake, write it up, man. I'm longing to, but all I know is that he gave it me in confidence, and on the condition that I didn't. I condense into a few sentences the professor's narrative. Well, as you can see, that's how it stands. McArdle looked deeply incredulous. Well, Mr. Malone, he said at last, about this scientific meeting tonight, there can be no privacy about that, anyhow. I don't suppose any other paper will want to report it, for Waldron was reported already 12 times, and no one is aware that Challenger will speak, so we may get a scoop, if we're lucky. You'll be there in any case, so you'll be able to give us a pretty full report. I'll keep space up until midnight. My day was a busy one, and I had an early dinner at the Savage Club with Tarp Henry, to whom I gave an account of my adventures. He listened with a sceptical smile on his gaunt face, and roared with laughter on hearing the Professor had convinced me. My dear chap, things don't happen like that in real life. People don't stumble upon enormous discoveries and then lose their evidence. Leave that to the novelists. The fellow is as full of tricks as a monkey house at the zoo. It's all absolute bosh. But the American poet? He never existed. But I saw his sketchbook. Challenger's sketchbook. Oh, you think that he drew the animal? Well, of course he did. Who else? Well, what about the photographs? There's nothing in the photographs. You, by your own admission, said you only saw a bird. A pterodactyl? But that's what he says. He put the pterodactyl into your head. Well then, what about the bones? Well, the first one out of an Irish stew, the second one vamped up for the occasion. If you're clever and you know your business, you can fake a bone as easily as you can fake a photograph. I began to feel uneasy. Perhaps, after all, I had been premature in my acquiescence. Then I had a sudden happy thought. Will you come to the meeting with me? I asked. Tarp Henry looked thoughtful. He's not a popular person. The genial Challenger, he said. A lot of people have accounts to settle with him. I should say he's the best hated man in London. If the medical students don't turn out, there'll be no end to a rag. I don't want to get into a bear garden. You might at least do him the justice to hear him state his own case. Well, perhaps it's only fair. All right, I'm your man for the evening. When we arrived at the hall, we found a much greater concourse than I'd expected. A line of electric broughams discharged their cargoes of white-bearded professors, while the dark stream of humbler pedestrians who crowded through the arched doorway showed that the audience would be popular as well as scientific. Indeed, it became evident to us as soon as we'd taken our seats that a youthful and boyish spirit was abroad in the gallery and the back portions of the hall. Looking behind me, I could see rows of faces of the familiar medical student type. Apparently, the great hospitals had each sent down their contingent. The behaviour of the audience at present was good-humoured, but mischievous. Scraps of popular songs were chorused with enthusiasm, which was a strange prelude to a scientific lecture. And there was already a tendency to personal chaff, which promised a jovial evening to others, however embarrassing it might be to the recipients of these dubious honours. When old Dr. Meldrum, with his well-known curly-brimmed opera hat, appeared upon the platform, there was a universal query of, "Where did you get that tile?" To which he hurriedly removed it and concealed it furtively under his chair. When gouty Professor Wadley limped to his seat, there was a general affectionate inquiry from all parts of the hall as to the exact state of his poor toe, which caused him obvious embarrassment. The greatest demonstration of all, however, was the entrance of my new acquaintance, Professor Challenger, when he passed down to take his place at the extreme end front row of the platform. Such a yell of welcome broke forth when his black beard first protruded round the corner that I began to suspect Tarp Henry was right in his surmise, and that all of this assemblage was there not merely for the sake of the lecture, but because it got rumoured abroad the famous professor would take part in the proceedings. There was some sympathetic laughter on his entrance among the front benches of well-dressed spectators, as though the demonstration of students in this instance was not unwelcome to them. Their greeting was indeed a frightful outburst of sound, and the uproar of a carnivora cage when the steps of the bucket-bearing keeper is heard in the distance. There was an offensive tone to it, perhaps, and yet, in the main, it struck me as more a riotous outcry, the noisy reception of one who amused and interested them, rather than one they disliked or despised. Challenger smiled with a weary, tolerant contempt, as a kindly man would meet a yapping litter of puppies. He sat down and blew out his chest, passed his hand caressingly down his beard, and looked with drooping eyelids and supercilious eyes at the crowded hall before him. The uproar of his advent had not yet died away when Professor Ronald Murray, the chairman, and Mr. Waldron, the lecturer, threaded their way to the front, and the proceedings began. Professor Murray will, I'm sure, excuse me if I say he has the common fault of most Englishmen, that of being inaudible. Why on earth people who have something to say which might be worth hearing should not take the slight trouble to learn how to make it heard is one of the strange mysteries of modern life. Their methods are as reasonable as trying to pour some precious stuff from the spring to the reservoir through a non-conducting pipe, which could be, by the least effort, opened. Professor Murray made several profound remarks to his white tie and to the water carafe on the table, with a humorous twinkling aside to the silver candlestick upon his right, none reaching the audience. Then he sat down, and Mr. Waldron, the famous popular lecturer, rose amid a general murmur of applause. He was a stern, gaunt man, with a harsh voice and an aggressive manner, but he had the merit of knowing how to assimilate the ideas of other men and pass them on in a way which was intelligible and even interesting to the lay public, with a happy knack of being funny about the most unlikely objects, so that the precession of the equinox or the formation of a vertebrae became a highly humorous process as treated by him. It was a bird's-eye view of creation, as interpreted by science, which, in the language always clear and sometimes picturesque, he unfolded before us. He told us of the globe, a huge mass of flaming gas flaring through the heavens. Then he pictured the solidification and the cooling, and the wrinkling which formed the mountains, the steam which turned to water, and the slow preparation of the stage upon which was to be played out the inexplicable drama of life. As to the origin of life itself, he was discreetly vague. That the germs of it could hardly have survived the original roasting was, he declared, fairly certain. Therefore, it had come later. Had it built itself out of the cooling, inorganic elements of the globe? Very likely. Had the germs of it arrived from outside upon a meteor? It was hardly conceivable. On the whole, the wisest man was the least dogmatic upon the point. We will not, or at least we had not succeeded up to date in making organic life in our laboratories out of inorganic materials. The gulf between the dead and the living was something which our chemistry could not as yet bridge. But there was a higher and subtler chemistry of nature, which, working with great forces over long epochs, might well produce results which were impossible for us. There the matter must be left. This brought the lecturer to the great ladder of animal life, beginning low down with mollusks and feeble sea creatures, and then up, rung by rung, through reptiles and fishes, till at last we came to the kangaroo rat, a creature which brought forth its young alive, the direct ancestor of all mammals, and presumably, therefore, of everybody in the audience. "No, no," from a sceptical student in the back row. If the young gentleman in the red tie who cried "no, no," and presumably claimed to have been hatched out of an egg, would wait upon him after the lecture, he'd be glad to see such a curiosity. There followed laughter. It was strange to think that the climax of the age-long process of nature had been the creation of that gentleman in the red tie. But had the process stopped? Was this gentleman to be taken as the final type, the be-all and end-all of development? He hoped that he would not hurt the feelings of the gentleman in the red tie if he maintained that whatever virtues that gentleman might possess in private life, still the vast processes of the universe were not fully justified if they were to end entirely in his production. Evolution was not a spent force, but one still working, and even greater achievements were in store. Thus, having made a general titter and played very prettily with his interrupter, the lecturer went back to his picture of the past, with the drying of the seas, the emergence of sandbags, and the sluggish, viscous life which lay upon their margins, the overcrowded lagoons, and the tendency of the sea creatures to take refuge upon the mudflats, where the abundance of food awaited them, and their consequent enormous growth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he added, "that frightful brood of saurians which affright our eyes when seen in the Wealden or the Solhofen slates, but which were fortunately extinct long before the first appearance of mankind upon this planet." "Question," boomed a voice from the platform. Mr. Waldron was a strict disciplinarian, with a gift of acid humour, as was exemplified upon the gentleman in the red tie, which made it perilous to interrupt him. But this interjection appeared to him so absurd that he was at a loss as to how to deal with it. So looks the Shakespearean who is confronted by a rancid Baconian, or the astronomer who is assailed by a flat earth fanatic. He paused for a moment, and then, raising his voice, repeated slowly the words, "which were extinct before the coming of man." "Question," boomed the voice once more. Waldron looked with amazement along the line of professors up the platform until his eyes fell upon the figure of Challenger, who leaned back in his chair with closed eyes and amused expression as if he was smiling in his sleep. "I see," said Waldron with a shrug. "It is my friend, Professor Challenger." And amid the laughter he renewed his lecture as if that was the final explanation and no more need to be said. But the incident was far from being closed. Whatever path the lecturer took amid the wilds of the past seemed invariably to lead him back to some assertion as to the extinct or prehistoric life, which instantly brought the same bull's bellow from the professor. The audience began to anticipate it and roar with delight when it came. The packed benches of students joined in, and every time Challenger's beard opened, before any sound could come forth, there was a yell of "Question!" from hundreds of voices, and an answering counter-cry of "Order!" and "Shame!" from as many more. Waldron, though a hardened lecturer and a strong man, became rattled. He hesitated, stammered, repeated, and got himself snarled in a long sentence, and finally turned furiously upon the cause of his troubles. "This really is intolerable," he cried, glaring across the platform. "I must ask you, Professor Challenger, to cease these ignorant and unmannerly interruptions." There was a hush over the hall, the students rigid with delight at seeing the high gods on Olympus quarrelling amongst themselves. Challenger levered his bulky figure slowly out of the chair. "I, in turn, must ask you, Mr. Waldron," he said, "to cease to make assertions which are not in strict accordance with scientific fact." The words unloosed a tempest. "Shame! Shame! Give him a hearing. Put him out. Shove him off the platform. Fair play." These emerged from the general uproar of amusement or exasperation. The chairman was on his feet, flapping both of his hands and bleating excitedly. "Professor Challenger, personal views, later. But there were solid peaks above his clouds of inaudible mutter. The interrupter bowed, smiled, and stroked his beard, and then relaxed into his chair. Waldron, very flushed and warlike, continued his observations. Now and then, as he made an assertion, he shot a venomous glance at his opponent, who seemed to be slumbering deeply, with the same broad, happy smile upon his face. At last the lecture came to an end. I'm inclined to think it was a premature one, as the peroration was hurried and disconnected. The thread of the argument had been rudely broken, and the audience was restless and expectant. Waldron sat down, and after a chirrup from the chairman, Professor Challenger rose and advanced to take the edge of the platform. In the interests of my paper, I took down his speech verbatim. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, amid a sustained interruption from the back. "I beg pardon, ladies, gentlemen, and children. I must apologize. I had inadvertently omitted a considerable section of this audience." Tumult, during which the professor stood, with one hand raised and his enormous head nodding sympathetically, as if he were bestowing a pontification upon the crowd. "I've been selected to move a vote of thanks to Mr. Waldron for the very picturesque and imaginative address to which we have just listened. There are points in it with which I disagree, and it has been my duty to indicate them as they rose. But, nonetheless, Mr. Waldron has accomplished his object well, that object being to give a simple and interesting account of what he conceives to have been the history of our planet. Popular lecturers are, in their nature, parasitic." Angry gesture from Mr. Waldron. "They exploit for fame or cash the work which was done by their indignant and unknown brethren. One smallest new fact obtained in a laboratory, one brick built into the temple of science, far outweighs any second-hand exposition which passes an idle hour, but can leave no useful result behind it. I'd put forward this obvious reflection not out of any desire to disparage Mr. Waldron in particular, but you may not lose your sense of proportion and mistake the acolyte for the high priest." At this point, Mr. Waldron whispered to the chairman, who rose and said something severely to his watercraft. "But enough of this." Loud and prolonged cheers. "Let me pass to some subject of wider interest. That is the particular point upon which I, as an original investigator, have challenged our lecturer's accuracy. It is upon the permanence of certain types of animal life upon the earth. I do not speak upon the subject as an amateur, nor, I may add, as a popular lecturer, but I speak as one whose scientific conscience compels him to adhere closely to facts when I say that Mr. Waldron is very wrong in supposing that because he himself has never seen a so-called prehistoric animal, therefore these creatures no longer exist. They are, indeed, as he has said, our ancestors, but they are, if I may use the expression, our contemporary ancestors, who can still be found with all of their hideous and formidable characteristics if one has but the energy and the hardihood to seek them out. Creatures which were supposed to be Jurassic monsters who would hunt down and devour our largest and fiercest animals still exist." Cries of "Bosh! Prove it! How do you know?" Question:
How do I know, you ask me? I know because I have visited their secret haunts. I know because I have seen some of them. Applause, uproar, and a voice of liar. Am I a liar? General hearty and noisy dissent. Did I hear someone say I was a liar? Will that person who called me a liar stand up that I may know him? A voice. Here he is, sir. An inoffensive little person in spectacles, shrugging violently, was held up amongst the group of students. Did you venture to call me a liar? No, sir, no, shouted the accused, and disappeared like a jack-in-a-box. If any person in this hall dares to doubt my veracity, I shall be glad to have a few words with him after the lecture. Liar! Who said that? Again, the inoffensive one, plunging desperately, was elevated high into the air. If I come down among you, a general chorus of "Come, love, come," which interrupted the proceedings for some moments, while the chairman, standing up and waving both his arms, seemed to be conducting music. The professor, his face flushed, his nostrils dilated, and his beard bristling, was now in proper berserk mode. Every great discoverer has been met with the same incredulity, the sure brand of a generation of fools. When great facts are laid before you, you have not the intuition, the imagination which would help you to understand them. You can only throw mud at men who have risked their lives to open new fields to science. You persecute the prophets, Galileo, Darwin, and I. Prolonged cheering and complete interruption. All this from my hurried notes taken at the time, which, given a little notion as to the absolute chaos to which the assembly had by this time been reduced. So terrific was the uproar that several ladies had already beaten a hurried retreat. Grave and reverend seniors seemed to have caught the prevailing spirit as badly as the students, and saw white-bearded men rising and shaking their fists at the obdurate professor. The great audience seethed and simmered like a boiling pot. The professor took a step forward and raised both his hands. There was something so big and arresting and virile in the man that the clatter and shouting died gradually away before his commanding gesture and his masterful eyes. He seemed to have a definite message, and they all hushed to hear it. I will not detain you, he said. It is not worth it. Truth is truth, and the noise of a number of foolish young men, and I fear I must add of their equally foolish seniors, cannot affect the matter. I claim, and I have opened a new field of science, and you dispute it. Cheers. Then I put you to the test. Will you accredit one or more of your own number to go out as your representatives and test my statement in your name? Mr. Summerlee, the veteran professor of comparative anatomy, rose amongst the audience. A tall, thin, bitter man with a withered aspect of a theologian. He wished, he said, to ask Professor Challenger whether the results to which he alluded in his remarks had been obtained during a journey to the headwaters of the Amazon made by him 2 years before. The professor answered that they had. Mr. Summerlee desired to know how it was that Professor Challenger claimed to have made discoveries in these regions which had been overlooked by Wallace, Bates, and other previous explorers of established scientific repute. Professor Challenger answered that Mr. Summerlee appeared to be confusing the Amazon with the Thames, that it was in reality a somewhat larger river, that Mr. Summerlee might be interested to know that with the Orinoco, which communicated with it, some 50,000 miles of country were opened up, and that in so vast a space it was not impossible for one person to find what another had missed. Mr. Summerlee declared with an acid smile that he fully appreciated the difference between the Thames and the Amazon, which lay in the fact that any assertion about the former could be tested, whilst the latter it could not. He would be obliged if Professor Challenger would give the latitude and longitude of the country in which the prehistoric animals were to be found. Professor Challenger replied that he had reserved such information for good reasons of his own, and would be prepared to give it with proper precautions to a committee chosen from the audience. Would Mr. Summerlee serve on such a committee and test his story in person? Mr. Summerlee: yes, I will. Great cheering. Professor Challenger: then I guarantee that I will place in your hands such material as will enable you to find your way. It is only right, however, since Mr. Summerlee goes to check my statement, that I should have one or more with him who may check his. I will not disguise from you that there are some difficulties and dangers. Mr. Summerlee will need a younger colleague. May I ask for volunteers? It is thus that the great crisis of a man's life springs out at him. Could I have imagined that when I entered the hall I was about to pledge myself to a wilder adventure than had ever come to me even in my dreams? Oh, but Gladys, was it not the very opportunity of which she spoke? Gladys would have told me to go. So I sprung to my feet. I was speaking, and yet I had prepared no words. Top Henry, my companion, was plucking at my skirts, and I heard him whispering, "Sit down, Malone. Don't make a public ass of yourself." At the same time, I was aware of a tall, thin man with dark, gingery hair a few seats in front of me. He was also on his feet. He glared back at me with hard, angry eyes, but I refused to give way. "I will go, Mr. Chairman," I kept repeating over and over. "Name! Name!" cried the audience. "My name is Edward Dunn Malone, and I am a reporter of the Daily Gazette. I claim to be an absolutely unprejudiced witness." "What is your name, sir?" the chairman asked my tall rival. "I am Lord John Roxton. I have already been at the Amazon, and I know all the ground, and I have special qualifications for this investigation." "Lord John Roxton's reputation as a sportsman and traveller is, of course, world famous," said the chairman. "At the same time, it would certainly be as well to have a member of the press on the expedition." "Then I move," said Professor Challenger, "that both these gentlemen be elected as representatives of this meeting to accompany Professor Summerlee upon his journey to investigate and to report upon the truth of my statements." And so, amid shouting and cheering, our fate was decided, and I found myself borne away in the human current which swirled towards the door, with my mind half stunned by the vast new project which had risen so suddenly before it. As I emerged from the hall, I was conscious for a moment of a rush of laughing students down the pavement, and of arms wielding a heavy umbrella which rose and fell in the midst of them. Then, amid a mixture of groans and cheers, Professor Challenger's electric Brofman slid from the curb, and I found myself walking away under the silvery lights of Regent Street, full of thoughts of Gladys and of wonder as to my future. Suddenly there was a touch at my elbow, and I turned and found myself looking into the humorous, masterful eyes of the tall, thin man who had volunteered to be my companion in this strange quest. "Mr. Malone, I understand," he said. "We are to be companions, what? My rooms are just over the road in the Albany. Perhaps, if you have the kindness to spare me half an hour, there are one or two things I would badly want to say to you." End of chapter 5. Well, I hope that you're enjoying chapter 5 and things are finally beginning to move, it sounds like, away from London and onto the adventure proper. If you're enjoying these, please subscribe to the video, and hopefully we'll be able to keep you entertained for a little bit longer with these. Well, I said a little bit longer. I think The Lost World is going to take up quite a bit of space yet. Yes, my word, that is still quite a bit of space. Yes, so there's still quite a bit left to go. Right, on that note, I'll bid you all goodbye and I'll see you next time. Take care.